I pushed the glass door open with my shoulder, feeling the cold metal frame scrape against my palm. At 72, my movements are slower than they used to be, but my hearing is still sharp enough to catch the sharp voice around the corner. It stopped me mid-step before I even saw who it belonged to. He's old. He won't fight back. The words weren't angry or careless, they were planned. And they were my nephew's. I stood still, my hand still resting on the door, the low hum of the building buzzing in my ears. His quiet laugh followed, the kind a man gives when he's sure the world is tipping in his favor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened to the sound of calculation in a voice I once trusted. It was the first moment I understood something wasn't right about why we were meeting here today. The hallway light flickered once above me, pulling my eyes up before I looked toward the reception desk. The young woman sitting there noticed the way I stood, frozen, tense, and her face softened with concern. She didn't ask questions. She simply stepped around the desk and placed a gentle hand on my arm, guiding me toward the waiting room as if she sensed something heavy had settled on me. I lowered myself into a chair, feeling the weight of what I'd heard settle deeper in my chest. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and paper, but it did nothing to settle the unease crawling up my spine. My nephew's voice replayed again, clear and sharp, every word cutting deeper the second time. I kept my eyes on the floor, trying to understand why a simple property mediation needed that kind of attitude behind it. A moment later, I heard footsteps, light, confident, familiar. He walked in with a smile stretched across his face, the kind he used when he wanted something. "Uncle, you're early," he said, too warm, too smooth. His eyes scanned me for a reaction, but I kept my expression still. He didn't know what I'd heard. He didn't know I had stopped just inches outside his line of sight. He sat across from me, tapping his foot lightly as if we were here to settle something small and harmless. But the words I'd heard had already shifted the ground beneath us. This wasn't just a dispute. This wasn't just paperwork. As he talked about nothing in particular, pretending the air wasn't thick with a lie, I felt a cold understanding form in the back of my mind. Whatever this meeting was supposed to be about, it was part of something larger, something I wasn't meant to see coming. I leaned back in the waiting room chair, and for a moment the quiet reminded me of the years that had brought me here. After my wife passed 2 years ago, the house felt too large and the days felt too long. I stopped doing certain things without even noticing, small chores, errands, simple tasks that once filled the silence. Grief has a way of shrinking a man's world, and mine had shrunk more than I realized. That was when my nephew started showing up more often. At first it felt like kindness. He would stop by with groceries, take me to appointments, or fix small things around the house before I even asked. I appreciated the help, and I told him so. But little by little his gestures changed shape. He began picking up my mail without asking, saying it was his way. He handled my bills to save me time, though I never said I needed saving. Each favor felt harmless on its own, but together they formed a pattern I hadn't wanted to recognize. I remember the first time he answered a question the doctor asked me. It was a minor appointment, nothing important, but he stepped in before I spoke. He called it helping keep things clear. Yet something about the confidence in his voice didn't sit right. I brushed it off, telling myself he was young and eager, not trying to take anything from me. It's strange how easily you can excuse things when you don't want to feel ungrateful. Then came the comments, small, quiet, almost casual. He would walk through the hallway of my house and mention how things should stay in the family, or how my property should go to someone who can use it. He said these things with a thoughtful tone, as if he were talking about the weather, not my life. I didn't react then. I didn't know how serious he was meant to sound. Over time, he started suggesting I simplify things, telling me I shouldn't burden myself with details. He offered to keep my documents organized, told me to trust him with small responsibilities. I didn't see the shadow behind his words until I heard what he said at the mediation center this morning. Sitting here now, replaying that sharp whisper. He's old. He won't fight back. Pulled all those moments into a single line. Every intercepted envelope, every answered question, every suggestion about the property suddenly fit together. His help hadn't just been heavy, it had weight because it had direction. And now I finally understood where that direction led. My nephew showed up the next morning carrying a thin folder tucked under his arm, the same easy smile on his face that he always used when he wanted something to look simple. He placed the folder on my table and called it Routine Title Clarification, saying the mediation center needed it before our next meeting. His tone was light, almost rehearsed, but his eyes kept drifting toward the folder as if checking whether I'd open it the wrong way. I slid the first page out and felt a small jolt tighten in my chest. There was a faint outline on the bottom corner, a soft gray tracing that looked like the beginning of my signature. It was subtle, barely visible unless you held it against the light, but it wasn't accidental. My hand stopped halfway down the page, and before I could say anything, he leaned over and flipped it to the next one. His laugh was too quick, too thin. Nothing important, uncle. Just a scribble from the printer. The next document was worse. It mentioned land access rights and boundary use agreements tied to my property, phrases I had never heard him mention before, and certainly nothing the mediation was supposed to involve. The language felt intentionally vague, just clear enough to seem legitimate. The way he pushed the folder closer to me made my stomach tighten. He said the mediator needed standard paperwork. But 2 days earlier he claimed everything was already handled. His words kept contradicting themselves, sliding between one explanation and another. I kept reading while pretending not to notice how tense he'd become. When I looked up, he wasn't watching the folder anymore. He was standing by the counter, pretending to straighten the mail. His phone was angled downward, the lens catching the edge of an envelope before he slipped it back into his pocket. He gave me a casual glance, but his jaw was tight. Something cold settled under my ribs. I didn't say anything. If he wanted to believe I hadn't noticed, I let him. When he left, I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway. Then I went back to the folder and took out each document one by one, copying them quietly on my old printer. I made copies of the envelopes on the counter too, each one marked with the date he handled them. The pile grew slowly, each sheet turning into another small piece of a larger pattern forming right in front of me. As I stacked the papers, I felt a shift, small, steady, and final. Whatever he was building, I needed proof of it before he pushed it any further. I carried the folder to my attorney's office early the next morning, keeping it tucked under my coat as if warmth alone could hide what was inside. His office was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every paper sound louder when it's set on a desk. When I slid the documents toward him, he adjusted his glasses, took one look at the clauses, and his expression changed in a way he didn't try to hide. He tapped the first page with his pen. The language wasn't about routine clarification at all. It was written to widen decision-making access, giving my nephew the ability to act on my behalf in matters tied to property use and transfers. He explained it plainly, without drama, but the weight behind his words was enough. I felt my jaw tighten as each sentence confirmed what I had started to fear. None of this was innocent. Then he opened the digital file copies I had given him. Metadata lined the bottom, small numbers and time codes that meant little to me, but he recognized them. The edits had come from a device I didn't own. Someone else had made changes late at night, long after I'd gone to bed. He sat back, exhaling slowly, and told me he'd seen similar tactics used against older clients, little shifts in paperwork hidden under the excuse of helping. As he explained, my phone buzzed twice. Both calls were from my nephew. I didn't answer. A minute later, another message appeared, telling me the signatures were urgent before mediation, and that delays could cause trouble. The tone wasn't panicked, it was strategic, trying to corner me with deadlines that didn't exist. On the way home, I stopped by the bank to handle a separate matter, but the teller recognized my name before I even gave it. She mentioned carefully that my nephew had visited 2 days earlier, asking general questions about my accounts. She didn't disclose details, but her concern was unmistakable. I felt a cold pull under my ribs, not shock anymore, but confirmation. I thanked her, left the bank, and drove home with the folder beside me on the seat, each bump in the road making the papers shift as if reminding me they were still there. When I got inside, I walked straight to my bedroom, pulled out the small fireproof box I kept under the dresser, and locked every essential document inside. Passports, deeds, old agreements, anything with my signature. I sat on the edge of the bed afterward, hands resting on the box, aware that whatever my nephew was trying to build, he wasn't finished. But now, neither was I. He showed up just after sunset, knocking twice before letting himself in like he always had permission. I was in the living room, sorting old mail, when he stepped inside holding a fresh stack of papers. He didn't waste time with greetings. Instead, he set the folder down on the coffee table and said the signatures needed to be handled tonight, as if my schedule belonged to him. His voice carried a push I hadn't heard before, one dressed as urgency but built from something harder. He sat across from me, tapping the folder with his finger. He said the mediator would penalize delays, and that waiting could make things worse. The words were sharp, rehearsed, and meant to box me in. I watched him talk, realizing the kindness he used to wrap around me had thinned. He kept glancing at the hallway, impatient, like he expected someone else to walk in and finish the job if I didn't comply. I told him I needed a minute and stepped toward the kitchen. Before I reached the doorway, I heard his voice, low and fast, as he spoke into his phone. He'll sign. He always does. There was no hesitation, no concern, just certainty that I would fold. I stood still, the refrigerator hum filling the space between us, and understood that none of this was accidental or rushed. He had been planning, building confidence with each small step I'd allowed. When I returned, he was already flipping pages toward me, guiding my hand to a line before I'd even seen the paragraph above it. I slowed him down, letting my eyes pass over the text he tried to shield with his palm. And then I saw it, tucked into the middle of a block of legal phrasing, was a clause shifting partial ownership of the property into his name. not after mediation, not pending review. Now tonight, I lifted the page slightly, just enough to read it again. His smile faded. His foot tapped the carpet once, then again. When I asked why this clause hadn't been mentioned, irritation tightened his voice. He said I was overthinking, that I was making this so difficult, as if basic caution was an insult to him. The friendly tone he always carried had drained out, leaving something cold behind. He leaned forward, pressing the pen into my hand with more force than needed. In that moment, I understood the real deadline he was racing. He wanted control before anyone else could stop him, and he expected me to hand it to him without a fight. The next morning, I sat across from my attorney in his quiet office, the new stack of papers resting between us. He didn't speak at first. He just lifted each page slowly, his brow tightening with every line he read. When the real estate specialist joined the meeting, he took one look at the transfer clause and nodded in a way that made my stomach sink. There was no confusion in his expression, only recognition. He said these weren't simple mistakes or rushed paperwork. They were structured steps toward taking control without my clear agreement. The specialist pointed out sections where language had been softened or shifted to appear routine, while actually handing over rights I never intended to give. He explained how someone could present these forms as standard to an elderly homeowner and walk away with legal leverage before the person understood what had happened. Hearing it said out loud made the room feel smaller. It wasn't guesswork anymore. It was a pattern, and I had been walking inside it without knowing. My attorney set the documents down and folded his hands. He said the part that bothered him most wasn't the forged tracing or the sudden deadlines. It was the tone in the nephew's messages, the urgency, the pressure, the expectation that I would sign without hesitation. He warned that men in my position were often portrayed as forgetful to justify rushed decisions. The thought made something tighten inside me, not from fear but from the quiet betrayal of being underestimated. We moved to practical steps. I activated financial alerts and limited who could access any accounts. My attorney drafted instructions blocking changes without my approval. The specialist suggested freezing certain property actions until after mediation. I agreed to all of it, feeling the weight of each decision but relieved to finally have ground under me instead of guesswork. As we wrapped up, my attorney leaned back, tapping the folder once with a steady hand. He told me I wasn't imagining anything. He said the behavior was coordinated, deliberate, and hinged on catching me alone. His voice stayed calm, but the message was clear. We needed one last piece of undeniable proof before stepping into mediation. When I returned home that afternoon, a voicemail waited on my phone. My nephew's voice was cheerful, too cheerful, telling me he had moved the mediation date up. He said it would help everything get settled faster. The speed in his planning told me all I needed to know. He felt time working against him now. I called my nephew that evening and told him I was ready to sign whatever needed signing at the mediation. I kept my tone steady, almost tired, and he accepted it too quickly. There was no hesitation on his end, no concern, just a short breath of relief before he said he'd handle the rest. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and let the silence settle around me. Pretending to give in felt strange, but it was the only way to see his plan fully unfold. The next morning, my attorney laid out the documents across his desk, forming a clean path through every inconsistency we'd found. He had prepared copies, metadata logs, and notes from the specialist. He even pulled out the voicemail where my nephew had shifted the mediation date without asking me. Seeing everything lined up in one place hardened something inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was the kind of cold resolve that grows when the truth stops hiding. By the end of the week, small cracks in my nephew's behavior began to show. He snapped at a clerk on the phone when she asked a simple question. He paced in my living room with restless energy when he stopped by, claiming he was just checking on me. His comments turned clipped and strange. Little phrases like, "Let's just get this over with," and "You'll thank me later." Each one carried the edge of someone who depended on an outcome they could no longer fully control. A neighbor I'd known for years caught me outside one afternoon. He hesitated before telling me he overheard my nephew speaking loudly near the driveway the night before. The words were plain and sharp. "The old man won't resist." Hearing that secondhand felt like a small blow to the chest, not because it shocked me anymore, but because it confirmed he had no doubt in his own victory. I placed every piece of evidence into a single folder, documents, notes, logs, all arranged neatly so nothing could be questioned. Holding it in my hands felt heavier than paper should feel. It was the quiet weight of truth, the kind that changes a room before anyone speaks a word. On the morning of the mediation, my nephew walked into the building with a confidence that almost looked rehearsed. His steps were quick, his shoulders high, and his eyes scanned the lobby as if the outcome was already sealed in his favor. I watched him from a few chairs away, saying nothing. The air between us felt tight, stretched by everything unspoken. By the time the administrator called us in, the tension had reached its highest point, silent, sharp, and waiting to break. The mediation room was colder than I expected, all glass panels and quiet echoes. I walked in with steady steps, holding the folder close, and my nephew sat at the long table with a smirk that told me he believed the day already belonged to him. He leaned back in his chair as if he were waiting for someone to hand him a trophy. I took the seat across from him, watching his expression shift when my attorney and the real estate specialist entered right behind me. For a moment he didn't move. His smirk wavered, then vanished altogether. His attorney straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing with a concern he tried badly to hide. The mediator glanced at the unexpected guests, then at me, asking in a calm tone if we were prepared to proceed. My nephew opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The room's air changed in a single beat. I placed the folder on the table and slid out the first document, the same page he had brought me 2 nights earlier. The faint pencil-traced signature line was still there. My attorney spoke first, pointing out the telltale marks and the mismatched formatting. My nephew shifted in his seat, shaking his head quickly as though motion alone could wipe away the evidence. His attorney reached for the page, scanning it with growing discomfort, and I saw the exact moment he realized what he was holding. That small flicker of unease spread across his face before he pushed the document slightly away as if it burned. Next, I laid down the metadata logs showing edits from a device that wasn't mine. The room fell even quieter. The specialist stepped forward, explaining the hidden transfer clauses that had been placed inside the stack of routine paperwork. His voice was steady and factual, and every sentence tightened the space around my nephew. My nephew's breathing grew heavier. He started blaming misunderstandings, saying he thought he was helping, saying he didn't know what half the documents meant. But his words tangled together, exposing intent instead of hiding it. Even his own attorney leaned back as if he no longer wanted to be seated beside him. The mediator raised a hand, stopping the excuses mid-sentence. She reviewed the last page, the one that would have shifted partial ownership without my knowledge. Her expression flattened, professional but cold. "Proceedings are halted," she said. "An investigation will begin immediately." The room went silent. My nephew stared at the table, the confidence drained from him, replaced by something small and unfamiliar. I sat still, not triumphant, not angry, just relieved the truth finally had a place to stand. The next morning began with paperwork instead of rest. My attorney walked me through each form slowly, making sure I understood every line before signing. The mediator had already filed the preliminary report, and now the official elder exploitation and document manipulation complaints were being submitted to the proper offices. It felt strange watching my own name appear in legal statements describing me as a vulnerable party. I never imagined I would need that kind of protection against someone I sat beside at family dinners. By afternoon, notices were already sent out barring my nephew from contacting any institution on my behalf. Banks, property offices, insurance providers, each one placed a note on my account. My attorney read the confirmation emails aloud as they came in, his tone steady, almost clinical. I listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in hearing his access revoked, only a slow, heavy relief settling in my chest. We spent hours adding new safeguards. My property records were updated with layered protections requiring in-person verification. Passwords were replaced with longer ones my nephew would never guess. Locks around the house were changed, and entry logs were connected to my phone. Each step felt both necessary and humiliating, as though I was rebuilding a life someone had tried to quietly dismantle while pretending to care for me. Family started calling, not to ask how I was, but to ask what happened. Some took his side instantly, saying I misunderstood, that he would never do such a thing. Others refused to take any stance at all, choosing silence over discomfort. Their voices blended together until every call felt the same, a reminder that people only believe what doesn't force them to look at their own family differently. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of protective documents my attorney left. The betrayal hit harder now that the chaos had settled. I helped raise that boy. I paid for his school clothes, his summer camps, his emergencies. I taught him to drive in the old sedan he later borrowed without asking. I trusted him with pieces of my life long before he tried to take all of it. But trusting him now would be foolish. By the time the sun set, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I went through each room, checking new locks, checking alerts, checking systems twice. It wasn't paranoia, just a new way of living. Distance wasn't a choice anymore. It was safety, and I accepted it. The mornings felt different once the dust settled. I woke up without the weight of someone else's urgency pressing on my shoulders. My routine became simple again. Coffee, a quiet walk, a slow check of the house before sitting at my desk. Nobody hovered behind me waiting to redirect my decisions. Nobody sifted through my mail or pushed papers across the table. For the first time in months, my life moved at a pace I chose. I began organizing everything with a sharper eye. Records were stored in labeled envelopes, each tucked into a locked drawer only I could access. Property files were placed in a fireproof box. I changed my phone number, updated every password, and told the bank to confirm any request with my voice alone. These were things I should have done years ago, but age makes you believe the people you love will always act with your interests in mind. That belief was a weakness I didn't recognize until someone tried to turn it into a weapon. As the days passed, I found myself thinking more clearly about what happened. Some people see an older man and assume he's easy to push aside. They imagine his memory is fading, his judgment softer, his resistance gone. They mistake kindness for frailty and trust for ignorance. What my nephew did wasn't born from need. It was born from the assumption that I wouldn't catch on, wouldn't push back, wouldn't fight for what was mine. My attorney stopped by a few times to check on me, always patient and steady. He never made me feel foolish for falling into that trap or embarrassed for not noticing the signs sooner. The real estate specialist sent follow-up reports without prompting, making sure every safeguard stayed in place. Their support reminded me that not all protection comes from family. Sometimes the people who choose to stand beside you do it more honestly than the people who share your blood. I no longer waste time wondering why my nephew chose that path. Loyalty is a choice, and he made his. Understanding that truth brought a kind of calm I didn't expect. The distance between us no longer felt painful, it felt necessary. In the quiet moments of the evening, I walked through the house I worked my entire life to keep. The walls held memories my nephew tried to claim, but they remained mine because I defended them. Control over my legacy was worth every difficult step, and in the end, I learned a truth that will stay with me for the rest of my days. Protect your rights, your home, and your name, because once you lose them, getting them back is a battle many never win.